Greetings to our viewers and audiences who are watching this episode of the Desk interview series. My name is Minh Phùng and I am editor-in-chief at The Desk, a student financial media outlet. The Desk is launching our interview series where we invite guest speakers who are experts in the field to discuss certain economic and social affairs. And this is our first ever episode. Without further ado, we are honored to have Professor Willem Buiter as the first ever guest speaker for our interview series debut. Professor Buiter is currently a visiting professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and an adjunct senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. He was global chief economist at Citigroup from 2010 to 2018 and a special economic advisor at Citigroup from 2018 to 2019. Previously, he was chief economist and special counselor to the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and he was also an original member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. Professor Buiter was appointed Commander of the British Empire. He is Fellow of the British Academy and also an honorary fellow at the United Kingdom's National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Professor, it is my honor to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's address the elephant in the room. We are currently living in one of the largest economic crises of the early 21st century. And for the majority of us here at the desk, as well as some of our viewers, I'm sure, we are experiencing this global economic crisis as we approach the end of our undergraduate studies and step into the workforce. And our current situation is actually quite similar to yours when you finished your undergraduate studies in 1971. Because it's the same year of the Nixon shock, the official collapse of the Bretton Woods system, and the rebirth of the global floating exchange rate mechanism that we still use today, and the dawn to a rough 2 decades. So when you graduated with an economics degree from University of Cambridge, how did the 70s, the Nixon shock, the fall of the Bretton Woods system, affect your career outlook or your interests at the time?
Well, it didn't really. I wanted to continue my academic studies. I did my undergraduate studies at Cambridge, and I got an offer from Yale to go there, and I went there for the next 4 years. And I started an academic career at that point, which lasted altogether 25 years. Then I did these other things. But the Nixon shock, the breakup of the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate arrangement, the remnants of the gold standard, was a much less severe shock than what we're stuck with now and what greets you, the entry of the post-undergraduate life. The Nixon shock, the Bretton Woods shock, was a shock, a financial shock affecting a number of advanced economies. And it only had an indirect effect, some trade, some capital movement, an indirect effect on emerging markets. This shock affects every country in the world. The COVID-19 makes no exceptions, knows no boundaries. And the degree of uncertainty attached both to the epidemiological side of the pandemic and to the economic and political response is unlike anything, I think, that you've ever seen. I wouldn't say this is unique in the last century and a half. It may be unique, full stop, that we never have seen such a widespread academic hitting all countries at the same time.
I see. Yeah, and I totally agree with you on that. And you did mention that you got an offer from Yale. And very interestingly, the next year you moved to the United States and you worked as a teaching assistant at the same time for the Honorable Professor James Tobin, who received a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. And I'm pretty sure it's bringing back old memories. And so how has Professor Tobin's Neo-Keynesian or new Keynesian school of thought influenced your economic school of thought?
Well, the specific school I've taken over bits of, and other bits I've left, and developed my own views or took other people's views. But what I've taken from Tobin was this unquenchable curiosity and the willingness to debate and to argue any point in any position. He was the ultimate scholar. Right? It was not so much what particular position he adhered to on a particular issue, whether the Phillips curve is vertical, downward sloping in the short run, vertical in the long run. These are all interesting questions. But his relentless pursuit of sort of logic and facts was the most impressive I have experienced in my academic life. He was quite unique. I was very fortunate to have him as my, my guru.
Sure, right. And do you have like a specific memory of your interactions with Professor Tobin that still stick to this day?
Well, there were so many events where we ended up, for instance, starting in complete disagreement, and suddenly, after a week or so, noticing that we had converged on a position somewhere between the two of us, original positions that we both found superior to what we started with. There were abstract things like the flow of funds models, how we should specify portfolio balance in dynamic economic models, whether it should be a stock equilibrium or a mixed stock flow equilibrium, all these abstract issues that we took very seriously and argued about harshly. We were standing on opposite sides of the table, speaking loudly at each other because we were so passionate. Right. Then we'd go down and have a cup of coffee, right? And when everybody cooled down. It was the way he practiced science rather than the specific propositions. And he, of course, was such a genius. He wasn't just a great theorist, he was an econometric champion as well. He developed important estimation methods in econometrics that are still used today that have nothing to do with his view on macroeconomics. Right.
That's awesome. And so during this early phase of your life, you're pretty much, it's pretty risky to say this, but you were in a bubble of Keynesian economics. But then the 80s pretty much changed that all, because you became professor of economics at University of Bristol, and then you transferred to being a professor of economics at London School of Economics during the 80s. But the 80s also the time for the Great Inflation. It was the time of the rise of neoliberalism across the world, from Latin America to Europe to the Thatcherism in the UK during the 80s recession. Being a professor who's had this strong background and interaction with other professors who worked in new Keynesian economics, did you see a rising popularity in conservatism, liberalism in the 80s amongst your students or your colleagues at this time?
It was a general social phenomenon associated with the elections of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that clearly changed the tone of the debate, made it more monetarist, created very great enthusiasm for rational expectations and market clearing models, representative agent models, all stuff that I considered to be good in parts, but very dangerous if taken uncritically as a whole. So yes, it was an era of conservatism and an era of what I would call new classical, not even post-Keynesian, neo-Keynesian, but new classical economics associated with the likes of Lucas, right? Sargent, Wallace. Well, I benefited greatly from their insights. I never bought into the methodology in an unqualified way. And I stayed deep down in the neo-Keynesian groove, augmented with the sensible bits of the West expectation hypothesis and the bits of efficient markets that make sense. So I was always willing to change my views. Keynes' famous remark, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? I very much agreed with that. So I was not wedded to any particular position, but I never bought uncritically into either the political conservatism of Thatcher and Reagan or in the new classical economic methodology that Lucas, Sargent, Wallace, Barrow, and others managed to sell to a large part of the economic profession. I was never part of that crowd.
I see. Very interesting. And so, in the 90s, moving to the 90s, you were, at the time, you were a professor of international macroeconomics at Cambridge University, but also during the late 1990s, 1996, 1997, you were chosen as one of the original external members of the Bank of England's newly formed Monetary Policy Committee. So could you tell us more about your story behind being chosen as an external member?
It was in 97, actually, that I was chosen, but yes, it came completely out of the blue. I wasn't a British citizen at the time. I am now, but I had dual Dutch and American citizenship. So somewhere in early 97, I got this call that said, would you be interested in being considered for external membership of the Monetary Policy Committee, the Bank of England? And I basically said, sorry, you must be mistaken, right? I'm not a British citizen, but thanks for asking. And they, very surprisingly, said, no, that's irrelevant. We consider non-British citizens, and we know that, of course. Now, not only were there two people, non-British citizens, myself and Dan Julius, part of the first external bunch of MPC members, but we just had the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who was not a British citizen. So it was completely unexpected and also, of course, very welcome, because how often do you get a chance to actually practice what you have been preaching in economics for many years and see whether it makes any sense?
Exactly. And you and amongst other members that you mentioned had the level of power to decide interest rates and the certain monetary policy tools. Could you tell us one decision that you've made in the committee that has had the most impact on the British economy?
Well, I must say, the 3 years I served, 97 to 2000, were, fortunately for the committee, rather calm years. Okay, we had the Asian-Russian crisis.
Yeah.
And we cut rates quite radically, and we carefully watched the development of liquidity conditions in British financial markets to make sure that there would be no threatening, dangerous spillover of the Russian and Asian unrest into the UK financial domain. But it turned out that it didn't take great monetary heroics to stop these external impulses from emerging market crises from disrupting economic life or even the financial system in a serious manner. So I must say we actually had quite an easy time of it. This is not like the great financial crisis or the COVID crisis, when the normal instruments, or the instrument we thought of as normal, which is the policy rate, bank rate, became unusable in a downward direction because it was at the zero, effectively the zero lower bound, and there was no willingness, there is no willingness among current members of the MPC to abolish or significantly lower the effective lower bound. Right? So they have to do really unorthodox things, like massive increases in the size of the central bank's balance sheet and the extension of the asset menu that they're purchasing in or investing in, the loans they make, which have much greater risk than we ever had to deal with. So now is the hard time. 2007, 8, 9, 10 were hard times to make monetary policy. When I had the privilege of being on the monetary policy committee, it was actually a very
calm
learning period. Yes, it was ideal.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. I wish I had that chance. I wish I had that call. So why did you leave the position after 2000? People would assume that with such a powerful impact on an economy, one would climb the ladder, become a governor.
That was simple. I had always held a position, and I stated so publicly, that one should not serve more than one term on the central bank policy making committee because it threatens independence. Now, I would have liked the single term to be somewhat longer than 3 years.
Sure.
Right? I would have liked a 5-year term or something like that. But I couldn't, on the one hand, argue that multiple terms threaten independence and should therefore be rejected, and then say, okay, there's one exception for me. Right? So I left with regrets, but grateful for what I'd learned and what I'd experienced in these 3 years.
For sure, for sure. And it does sound like you still yearn for that experience again, working as a member of the MPC. And so now, stepping into the 2010s, just after the great financial crisis of 2008. So you've been working in academia, and you've worked in the public sector, and now you are jumping ship to join Citigroup as a global chief economist in 2010. So, but interestingly though, you joined Citigroup after you once said in 2009 in a blog, I believe, that Citigroup was, and I quote, a conglomeration of worst practices from across the financial spectrum. So why did you jump ship? Why Citigroup?
Well, first of all, those statements were taken in the run-up to and during the beginning of the great financial crisis and reflected financial management at the time. When I joined Citi in 2010, the company was already 25% owned by the US government. So this was not the old Citi. Incidentally, it wasn't my first private sector engagement. The 5 years before I joined Citi, I spent 2 days a week as an advisor with Goldman Sachs.
Right. Oh, yes.
3 days a week at the LSE. So I don't see there's any contradiction between my earlier statements and my eagerness to work in this financial giant that was going through this transformation.
Right. And was working in the private sector in these, like you said, these giants more exciting than working in academia and in public administration?
I think there's a time for everything,
Sure.
right? And I did things, I think, in the right order. I did my academic work in the years that my academic capacities were greatest. And then when I went to Citi, I could make use of, what was it, the 71st, of 25 years of academic experience to try and bring insights, experience, and what I'd learned as an academic, bring that to bear on Citi's business. So there was a right time for everything, and I think I did things in the right order, and I enjoyed it very much indeed.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. So, what were the most memorable projects or office stories or incidents that you were a part of when you were at Citi? And it's totally your discretion to share with us.
Well, clearly, 2010 was still part of the aftermath of the worst financial crisis that the world had seen, right? So that was this exciting, trying to understand and if possible predict global economic financial development. Remember, Citi was the most global of all commercial banks. There's physical presence in 100 countries, right? So just trying to make sense of an unprecedented financial crisis that had created havoc in the real economies, first in advanced economies, but then also in emerging markets as capital flight and emerging market economic mismanagement made for deep and lasting crisis in that part of the world. So one of the most exciting things was that I did get to see, observe, and learn about emerging markets and developing economies to a much greater extent than I ever had before, because Citi was such a global bank.
I see. And so, thank you for sharing your experience throughout your experience in academia, as well as in the public sector and the private sector. So let's bring all that and jump to the present. So, in this global financial crisis right now, to that 2020, through a lot of your columns on Project Syndicate that I've read, you mentioned a lot this theory, modern monetary theory, MMT, and it's becoming more and more discussed and relevant. A lot of the ideologies of MMT are being shown through the unprecedented liquidity operations of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, especially monetizing the deficit that ensued these fiscal programs, these stimulus packages. But then the idea of a central bank has always been, like you said before, independent, apolitical. And do you think the unprecedented level of monetizing this deficit that we're seeing is the sign that perhaps MMT-like operations in such a crisis is necessary?
Well, I think clearly with monetary policy of the conventional variety, rate cuts being basically out of commission in advanced economies because we are at or near the zero lower bound, the effective lower bound, the only instrument you have left is the size and the composition of the balance sheet. And you can, MMT-wise, monetize fiscal stimuli, make the government not obliged to go to the markets, but to sell its debt effectively to the central bank.
Yeah.
That I think in the situation we're in is entirely appropriate.
Sure.
The demand for central bank money in most advanced economies, I'm not just talking the US and the ECB here, talking Japan, talking UK, is effectively unbounded at the moment. Right? So you can monetize fiscal stimuli without any material risk of inflation.
Right.
And that's what I think most economists would agree with is the situation we're in today. Modern monetary theory, the way I understand it, says it's basically always like that. Right. You can always monetize. The threat of this becoming inflationary impulse is either not there at all or is so rare that we can safely ignore it.
Right.
This means, therefore, that there are effectively no limits on the size of the fiscal stimulus.
Right.
And the associated government deficit that the Treasury can engage in. As long as the Treasury can borrow, issue debt in denominators no currency, and if for the if there's a central bank to buy it up, there is no limit to financial funding limit to the size of the fiscal stimulus.
Right.
It's only if demand through the stimulus and the monetization gets pushed up to levels that at last hit capacity output, hit the full employment constraint, that we are likely to see inflationary consequences or indeed increase in interest rates of the kind that we haven't seen for years and may not see for years. So in the short run, right, in advanced economies, I'm an MMT man, because I think the policy prescription makes sense with the slack that is there in the economy and the fact that the central banks are in a liquidity trap.
Right.
But I do keep in mind the fact that circumstances can change, that capacity constraints can become binding, and that it is possible that interest rates will lift their ugly faces from the zero lower bound, and that we therefore will have material obstacles to further monetary fiscal stimulus. But we are not there by a long shot.
I see. And one thing you bring up that's really, really key to MMT is the ability to issue debt in their own currency. Mm-hmm. However, all of what we're talking about and sort of the consensus in the markets right now is, and this is my question to you, is also, do you think that MMT is only applicable for the United States, given its exorbitant privilege, as coined by Alan Greenspan, the US dollar? Because the US dollar right now, there's a huge shortage. The ratio between supply and demand of the US dollar across on the international stage is very low. And central banks and corporations outside of the United States, they were desperate for that US dollar. And they would do anything to print more of their currencies and devalue their currencies in order to buy US dollar, or through the Fed use those swap lines. Do you think that MMT is only applicable for the United States? The low level of risk when it comes to high inflation is only applicable to the United States due to the reserve status of the US dollar?
No, this is not a matter of absolute, it's a matter of degree. Okay. The US government, one, can borrow in its own currency, and B, can have this debt monetized with money that is the only serious global reserve currency.
Yeah.
So they win on these two fronts. Many other advanced economies have the first privilege, that their authorities, fiscal authorities, can borrow in debt denominated in their own currency. This is not actually true for the Eurozone, because since no national fiscal authority has control over its monetary authority, the option of monetizing the domestic currency debt is not there. So they're actually more like emerging markets in that regard. But it is to some extent less than the US for Japan, for the UK, and some of the smaller currencies that are freely traded and considered quite desirable. But there's only one global reserve currency, there's the US dollar. So the ability of the US government to engage in monetary fiscal stimulus is in principle unparalleled, even though if you look at the long historical record, the Japanese government has of course gone further. They have been at this for almost 20 years, and they have built up a central bank balance sheet to GDP ratio of well over 100% now.
Yeah.
So this tells you, okay, the yen may not be a global reserve currency the way the dollar is, but if there is enough demand, both for the debt and the currency, and in Japan, the demand is very strong domestically, there's a lot you can do even if you're not the dollar. I would also say that we're likely to see the gradual evolution of the renminbi towards global currency status. So I expect that in the not too distant future, that we will see the Chinese government endowed with the same capacity to borrow globally and if necessary monetize. We're not there yet, but we're clearly going to get there because China is the new elephant in the global economy. Yeah. And their currency will, I think, in due course, become a global currency.
Yeah.
Reserve currency.
But what's interesting, though, I just want to bring this up real quick, is that China is one of the, if not the only countries to have all three corners of the triangle when it comes to a financial system, like a pegged currency, freedom of flow of capital, and also trade-wise. So it's interesting to see your outlook.
They don't have free capital mobility, right? That's how they can have a fixed exchange rate and the independent monetary policy. They have really tight controls still on capital outflows. They're more encouraging of capital inflows, but again, that is something that in principle they can alter. So I would not say that they have all three corners of the impossible triangle in action, because they definitely have restrictions on capital outflows, which are one reason why they're not a global reserve currency yet.
Right.
I think they will get there.
Right, I see. And coupling with Xi Jinping's long-term Belt and Road Initiative, where they are basically monetizing political power when it comes to building ports and maritime routes and railways in other countries, and basically reviving the old Silk Road that's pretty much China-centric. So I think I do share with you that point in sort of the outlook for the reserve status for the renminbi. Another elephant in the room right now, and this is stepping away across the pond from the United States, is the Eurozone. So during this, for the past months, a lot of these words, solidarity, Euroscepticism, has been the buzzwords as topic of discussion. People are asking how a supranational system, such as the European Union, is going to salvage its troubled Eurozone without an established banking union, without a European deposit insurance scheme, or a fiscal union, which is a power that individual sovereign states in the European Union probably will never give away, because they've given away their monetary policy power already. Do you think that the Eurozone's halfway design makes it prone to economic crises like 2008, as we've seen, and right now in 2020, and therefore prone to populism and political polarization in Europe?
Well, I think that this financial crisis, this economic crisis, the COVID crisis, has polarized politics, not just in Europe, in the Eurozone, but all over the world, right? I mean, it's led to increased inequality, and it's led to polarization in the US as well as in Europe. In Europe, there's some more contrasting and often conflicting views on how to proceed, especially with fiscal support for fiscally weak countries. That, I think, has been fudged so far. It is likely going to be fudged again. We have a one-off arrangement that will make $750 billion available centrally, 500 billion of which is actually grants, and could therefore be a non-trivial contribution to the fiscally weak Eurozone member states. Unfortunately, most of that money is going to the Central and East European member states, who are not actually in fiscal dire straits, most of them, and the countries that need the fiscal stimulus and can't do it without external aid from fellow Eurozone members, Italy, Greece, are only getting very small bites of this pie. I think that the design of the Euro system is fatally flawed. Right? They need a monetary union. They need a proper banking union.
Yeah.
They made good progress there, but not enough. Deposit insurance, of course, is part of that, and they are nowhere near serious, large-scale, high-coverage deposit insurance scheme, and as regards fiscal backup for either the central bank or national authorities out of some common fiscal fund, the best we're going to have is an ad hoc, one-off intergovernmental arrangement that will be presented as a fiscal union, but is only for as long as the crisis.
Yeah.
I think this system is extremely vulnerable. It could collapse.
Yeah.
Italy could crash out if it doesn't get the right support, and if we have a second phase in the crisis that makes it impossible for countries like Italy to fund the necessary domestic fiscal stimulus without having control over their own monetary policy. It's a material risk. I hope it doesn't happen because I think the European experiment is an important one, not just economically, but politically as well. But I think we have a half-baked monetary union, and we do not seem to be moving resolutely to fill in the gaps, fiscal and banking union especially.
That's right. That's right. And that's the sort of thing that I've had a privilege to read about. And from a book, it's called "And the Weak Suffer What They Must" by former finance minister Yanis Varoufakis of Greece, and he touched upon the holes that are not patched in the Eurozone and how that is going to lead to eventually a disintegration of this, like you said before, the European experiment. And we'll have to see what's next. And that's pretty much the sort of big questions, big economic questions that generally the consensus and we at the desk, as well myself, have for you. And on a personal note, I would like to close this episode, this interview episode, with some fun, personal, lighthearted questions, as opposed to the very heavy economic machinery topics that we've talked about. So, you said that you are a sci-fi lover. So, which is your favorite sci-fi novel?
Oh, I'm afraid I'm an oldie. This is The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There's nothing like it before or since. So that's an easy one, but it also shows my age.
Right. Which character is your favorite?
Oh.
Or maybe which character you look up to?
There are a lot of fascinating characters in there, from Gandalf to Frodo to Bilbo.
Yeah.
Pippin, Merry, the guys that have the fun.
Right.
The humans, I think, are the least interesting ones. It's the person,
of course,
that really take the cake.
Yeah, for sure. And also, you said that you have a love for poems. Favorite poet?
They're Dutch poems. They wouldn't be known to any of you here.
Oh, like we'll search it up, and who knows? You know, once you bring it out, and it probably grows on us.
No. The Dutch poems with a strong religious undercurrent, which I grew up with as a child, that have stuck with me.
Sure.
I can let you have the titles when I recall them, but as it is, I only know the text of the poems themselves. They're beautiful. They are challenging.
Okay.
And they make use of language in a way that is incredibly powerful.
Perfect. Sounds good. Please let me know. Favorite movie?
Probably High Noon.
High Noon.
Too old for you again. This is from 1950, I think, or thereabouts. And
right.
Terry Cooper and Gene Kelly. It's a Western. It's a Western.
Yes, I was going to bring that up.
In the format of a Greek drama. Everything plays itself out in 24 hours.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay. I'll put that in mind. And an economist or a colleague that you look up to?
Well, I have to say James Tobin.
Right. Okay.
The man who made a difference. I also was fortunate as an undergraduate to get to know somewhat James Meade, who was another Nobel Prize winner and a great man. In fact, Cambridge was full of great guys at the time. Nicholas Caldor, Joan Robinson,
right?
Who start a whole new branch of economics. So yes, these are mostly, this was the great generation. The 30s and the war period created, I think, the most momentous generation of economists ever, before or since.
Right, right.
All the challenges, the main challenges that people felt society faced were economic. And growing up in the 30s, of course, it's not hard to see how one could come to that conclusion. Why so many people of these incredible brains chose economics as their subject.
For sure, for sure. And lastly, to close our wonderful, wonderful episode, and I've had such an honor and privilege talking to you today. If you could give young Willem, who just finished his undergraduate studies in 1971, if you could give him an advice, what would it be?
Go into academia, study most intensely the things you don't understand or think you disagree with, and try to answer both the why and the how questions, and be never satisfied unless you also can relate the abstract theory to the economic and political reality that you're dealing with. Economics is a social science, and it should not be treated as just a branch of applied mathematics. Its interface with and its direct relevance to concrete real-world issues has to be recognized at all times.
Professor Willem Buiter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.